Abstract. This research looks at how perceptions of deservedness and group identity affect punitive behavior in competitive social exchanges, even when that behavior comes with a cost. Two hypotheses were tested using a lab experiment. Hypothesis 1 predicted that the loss of a perceived earned advantage would foster greater rates of punitive behavior contrary to the individual's self-interest than a loss of a perceived random advantage, and was primarily informed by distributive justice theory. Hypothesis 2 predicted that the loss of an advantage to an out-group member would foster greater rates of punitive behavior that is contrary to the individual's self-interest than the loss of an advantage to an in-group member. Data obtained resulted in marginally statistical significant support for Hypothesis 1, which became increasingly statistically significant when race and geography were controlled for. Hypothesis 2 was not statistically supported. Reasons for this are discussed as well as suggestions for future research. Introduction. Tea Party movement supporters show up at rallies holding racially charged banners knowing that their movement will suffer harsh criticism. Black Bloc portions of the Occupy movement destroy property during protests knowing that this could likely decrease support for their cause. Palestinian militants fire mortar shells into Israeli territory knowing that they will be ineffective and will likely result in harsh retaliation. Students of color openly tease their more academically successful peers knowing that they could be subject to disciplinary action. In each of these cases, people are attacking others even though doing so appears to be counterproductive, contrary to their interests, and will likely entail significant costs. Of what benefit are these behaviors? What function do they serve? This research began with an interest in the Tea Party movement and centered on questions addressing the seemingly contradictory nature between many Tea Party supporters' social and economic interests, and their attitudes and behaviors toward potentially self-beneficial social policies, such as the proposed healthcare reforms that were debated on the national stage in 2010. However, an individual behaving in ways that appear to be contrary to their own social and economic interests and that come at a cost is not unique to the Tea Party movement. As the above examples illustrate. In each example, individuals willingly take on costs in order to punish others who are perceived as having or threaten to take something away from them that they feel entitled to. I developed an initial argument that those individuals who believe they are entitled to or believe they have earned something that has been or is threatened to be taken away from them will demonstrate punitive behaviors at higher rates than individuals who do not have the sense of entitlement. Further, I developed a second argument that when individuals experienced a loss that benefited an out-group member, higher rates of punitive behavior would result than the same loss to an in-group member, even when this behavior came with a cost. The first argument was primarily informed by distributive justice theory, while the second argument was primarily informed by social identity theory. This study used a lab experiment to test its hypotheses. Theory. Distributive justice theory is concerned with how resources and costs that affect individuals and groups are fairly